Your Excellencies, dear friends, welcome to IPI for this inaugural showing of the Tim Slade documentary, The Veto, which we at IPI have the pleasure of co-hosting with the Permanent Mission of Liechtenstein to the UN. We're delighted that Tim is with us, and after the showing, he, along with Professor Jennifer Trahan and I and myself, will each make a few remarks, some comments, observations, and then have a short conversation before then entertaining questions and observations from all of you. But first, it gives me a great pleasure to ask Ambassador Christian Venevesser, the PR of Liechtenstein, known to and admired by everyone here for his extraordinary work on this issue over the years, to take the floor and to welcome you all. So please, Christian.
Thank you so much, Zaid, and thank you all so much for coming. It's a great pleasure to do this with you, Zaid. I mean, for us, it's a bit of a personal history. Of course, we have been talking about the issue that we will be discussing tonight for over 20 years. So it's really great to be here. With you. It takes a courageous man to make a movie about the UN Charter. And it takes a more courageous man to make a movie about a word that is not in the Charter, that is the veto, but it is the most talked about issue often in parliaments, among think tanks, among states, the veto, which is so much at the heart of the problems that we have with the Security Council. And of course, it is part of the Charter that we have given ourselves in 1945. So the power that we have given to 5 states to unilaterally block a decision by the Security Council. And I'm very grateful to Tim for his interest in this topic and for trying to take this out and bring it closer to a broader audience. Because we, as diplomats, NGOs, think tankers, and so on, we know this issue, but it's really, really important that people out there understand. So I really want to thank you and pay tribute to you, and I very much look forward to both the movie and then the discussion afterwards. Thank you so much.
The veto, in essence, is a failure of imagination.
Those against.
It doesn't inspire, it doesn't create, it doesn't propose. It's just a dull club with which you beat any initiative into non-existence.
The purpose of the veto was to prevent conflict among the great powers. Personally, I think it's one of the reasons why we haven't had a third world war.
En contra.
If you could give all states the veto, they'll all willingly take it. But then you wouldn't have an international community. We'd all be in our tribes, beating the life out of each other. And all the regulations we have that delineate what is acceptable behavior from what isn't wouldn't exist.
Even in 1945, the states that created the UN could not have given the Security Council power to aid and abet genocide or war crimes or crimes against humanity, because that power almost definitionally cannot have been given power to aid crimes. It's not there.
It is profoundly disappointing and disturbing to see a fourth veto.
The use of the veto to block a balanced resolution.
But to be a member of the council and experience it was very frustrating and leaves one feeling, what on earth are we going to say to the outside world? It's used almost like a sledgehammer.
The vetoes are just flying all over the place right now.
Those against?
That interest in preserving the effectiveness of the council or its standing as a body that has waned very significantly.
I'm not attacking the veto power. It's clearly there. It's in the UN Charter. It's not going anywhere. But if we actually challenge the reading of the veto, what could they have done in Darfur to prevent the crimes? What could they have done in Syria?
The price has been heavy for all of those who could have benefited from collective action by the Council, and tragically, in millions of cases, did not.
Each day that passes risks a deepening failure to meet our moral obligations and duties.
We have read the veto as if it's above all law, above all legal obligations, but it's simply not. We can't simply accept, oh, nothing can be done.
So perhaps the first question that I'd like to pose is to Tim, it's to you. Just before we came out into this hall, I asked Christian, because we've been here a very long time at the UN or in and around the UN. There's some who've been here even longer, but I won't mention them by name. So Larry Johnson, you can rest easy. But we've been here so long, and I don't remember ever seeing a documentary about the veto. Certainly not by the UN, not by DPI. And so, Tim, what motivated you to actually produce a documentary about this issue?
So I think it was a similar question to which Jennifer's students asked. So several years ago, I made a film about cultural heritage. And so in looking at international law around cultural heritage, particularly as this was being finished in 2016, so Syria became a sort of large part of that. And I was looking at Aleppo in this film. And so I guess it sort of became evident that this constant blockage was the veto in terms of a tribunal for Syria, et cetera. So I think it was realizing that there was this phenomenon that, you know, as Christian said, isn't even mentioned by name, but is this blockage, which is sort of both obscure in a sense, but also obviously incredibly impactful. And I think I wanted to, I think I mentioned the idea to someone and they sort of were like, oh, that sounds very cerebral or very sort of obscure. And I think to your point, at the end of the film, it's like, it's not, this isn't an academic thing and it's not a sort of conceptual thing, obviously. It's an actual, as Jennifer kept reiterating, it's the impact of that is massive and, global, and it's, yeah. So
we'll come back to you on this point. Perhaps I can also turn to Christian. I mean, the attention you received over the Liechtenstein resolution and the effect it seems to have, certainly in academia, you see the response by students, which is very strong. And Christian, we noticed, of course, in Pact for the Future, there was also reference to Article 27.3, that it must be abided by, that it must be observed, I mean, all the provisions. So what is happening at the UN? I mean, is there a change in mood, do you think, that will open up a space for further discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have really moved this forward pretty well, and I think we're in the process of creating a slightly different mindset in the membership. Because, you know, I have always been of the view that for us to just bash the Security Council from the outside and to say, you guys are terrible, that's just too easy for us to do. So we should not lament that the Council is unable to do its things, its work, but we should say, well, if you can't do it, then we will. And I think the movie shows really well that, in a way, that was the intention of the drafters of the Charter. And it shows how vibrant a body the General Assembly was. And the veto initiative has rectified that institutional balance. So now if something is blocked in the Council, it goes to the GA, and the GA can make decisions. And legally, there is very little that the General Assembly cannot do. It cannot, impose sanctions. It cannot do enforcement measures under Chapter 7. But everything else, the General Assembly can do. And people, in my view, make way too much of the fact that a council decision is legally binding, a GA decision is only a political decision. Because we've had council decisions where council members walk out of the Security Council and say, oh well, you kind of don't have to do this. This is not legally binding. And you've had states that were dealt with in council decisions that said, we don't care, we're not going to do it. And there's no consequence. So my question is, what's the difference between a legally binding resolution and political resolution? And the political resolution in the General Assembly that has 143 votes, 150 plus votes, as we saw in the movie, in my view, carries as much weight. And I think that is where we are going with this, and that's where we need to go, and that is, like why I'm hopeful. I mean, the line that struck me the most in the movie, and I wrote a note to Tim on the weekend when I watched the footage, is when the U.S. ambassador said the veto is going to wither away. In what, 46, 47? Yeah, 46. So that's what the people thought who wrote the charter. That's what a permanent member said. At the time of the founding of the UN. Here we're sitting in 24, thinking, oh, there's nothing. So the veto, very far from withering away, has grown into this monster that actually, has an effect far beyond even what we see. Yeah. So it's the threat of the use of the veto, but also the role that the permanent members have in the system as a whole, in appointments of senior officials and on budget issues, on everything. So, and that really is something we just need to go back to the roots, because at the end, the treaty is not the biggest problem here. The treaty is what we have done with it. Yeah. The problem is what we've done with it. So.
Yeah. No, I think one has to be careful as well, because the General Assembly, yes, I mean, it's accepted that the decisions are of a recommendation, in the nature of a recommendation, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly, and it has had an impact, arguably, in the advancement of rights across the world. So it's not something cheap. It can lend to something very dear to us as humans. So we need to bear that in mind. Jennifer, you're sitting next to two former presidents of the Assembly of States Parties of the International Criminal Court. You were motivated by the horrors that we've seen across the world for decades, and the inability for collective action to embark to try and stem the suffering of people, and for the Council to at least not impede an action which could only be collective if it's going to be effective in response to sort of Jus Kogan's obligation and getting involved to stop the genocides and acts of genocide. So tell us a little bit about your idea, and you have a book that you've written, an excellent book, and I hope all of you will be able to read it. But tell us about your book and what the idea is. You alluded it to in the film, but if you could express it again.
Great, thank you so much. And first I would like to thank International Peace Institute for hosting this wonderful film showing. And thank you to Tim for making the film. So the film has framed the veto as a necessary but flawed piece of our international peace and security architecture. And it really begs the question, what can we do at this point in time? I mean, we see it so clearly linked to the atrocities, and what can be done. And my remarks are about veto use when there's ongoing or the serious risk of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So I cabin my arguments in the book and tonight to that situation. And these are situations where the veto use is probably ultra-virus, beyond the law. What do I mean? I refer to 3 levels of legal arguments. So for the non-lawyers in the audience, I apologize if this gets a little wonky, but I need to give some of the details that the really are arguments that can and need to be made. So we heard Richard Goldstone say that the Security Council is not above the law. And in fact, there is a lot of ICJ, International Court of Justice law, to that effect. And then the question is, well then, is the veto completely above the law? And my arguments in the book suggest no, the veto sits within a system of international law, and it's cabined by these arguments. So we have Jus Kogan's. So we say the prohibition of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity are at that very highest level of the law. So the ILC tells us, International Law Commission, in the RCWA, Articles on the Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts, a state must cooperate to bring to an end through lawful means serious breaches of peremptory norms, violations of peremptory norms, that's use Kogan's. It must not recognize as lawful these situations and must not render aid or assistance to them. So the question is then, well, can all of these obligations be ignored when a state gets into the council chamber? And in effect, what is occurring is, assume there's genocide occurring and there is a plan to stop it. 9 countries support it in the council and the veto is cast. Well, that veto is then aiding the genocide. The ICJ says this is impermissible. States may not aid use Kogan's violations. The Security Council is a body under international law. It is a subject of international law. So we have violations at that level. The second level are the purposes and principles of the UN. And you made these remarks years ago. I thought it was so creative in the book, and then I discovered Zaid had said a lot of my arguments already, that the Charter has certain purposes and principles. And there's a lot of International Court of Justice law, again, that these are binding on the Security Council. And we see this also stated in 24.2 of the Charter, that the Security Council must act in accordance with the purposes and principles. And in the Charter, it also says that UN member states must act in accordance with the purposes and principles. And the P5 are UN member states. So is the veto subject to this? Well, definitionally, yes. Because the Security Council's powers only derive from the Charter. They don't have power to violate, to go above the Charter. As mentioned in the film, this is almost definitionally not granted. And the final level of argument is at the treaty law level. For instance, under the Genocide Convention, the obligation to prevent genocide. And already years ago, Louise Arbour was writing that a veto in the face of genocide has got to be at odds with the Genocide Convention and the obligation to prevent genocide. And another obligation we don't focus, I think, enough on is Common Article 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions and additional protocols 1 and 3. It says a state must respect and ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. If they're casting a veto in the face of war crimes, are they ensuring respect? No, they're acting at odds with the Geneva Convention obligations. So these are the 3 levels. And if there are states in the audience, I request them to consider going back beyond where the Act Code of Conduct has gone, the French-Mexican initiative, which pushed for voluntary veto restraint. Please don't use your veto. But after years, we know only 2 of the permanent members agree, 3 do not. If you want to go a step further, it really is to question some of the legality of these vetoes being cast and make statements on the record, as Canada has done. The veto should only be used as consistent with the UN Charter and international law. States could consider embodying some of this in a General Assembly resolution, or, as the prosecutor mentioned, Prosecutor Bensouda, asking a question of the International Court of Justice, a question as, does existing international law contain limitations on the use of the veto power by permanent members of the UN Security Council in situations where there's ongoing genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes? And if anyone wants more of these details, there are a couple flyers at the front, and it spells out this question that could be asked. And I have many more detailed explanations. I'm happy to give out handouts, or they can be found in the book. And a few of my arguments also apply to a veto cast in the face of ongoing aggression, with the permanent member shielding its own aggression by its veto use. And I look whether that's in accordance with the UN Charter and use Kogan's obligations. And I have separate law journal articles that I can give you on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Tim, we understand that what you've served up tonight is only a sample of what you're intending to serve, that there is a longer version of this. I'm putting you on the spot here. I haven't asked you this ahead of time. Are you going to take requests from the audience on what you should be including in the remaining 30 minutes? Because I'm tempted now to turn to the audience. Yeah. And I have mentioned Larry Johnson because he's an old friend, and he was a former Assistant Secretary General in the Office of Legal Affairs. And he did send me a note. And I don't know, can I volunteer or comment, Larry, or shall I raise it on your behalf?
What have I done to you recently?
Yeah, Larry was my boss, my first boss at the UN, a very good boss. Larry says,
payback time.
So Larry says, if we go that route of advisory council seeking advisory opinion of this ICJ through the General Assembly, and as we've seen with other advisory opinions, just ignored by the veto-wielding member of the Security Council, ignored or they're opposed, and the General Assembly resolutions are opposed. What can be done to prevent the permanent member who's clearly violating Jus Cogens norms from continuing in that action? I think, did I frame it right? Or a very sloppy, clumsy way of framing it. Larry, do you want to refine it?
The only thing I would say, thank you very much, I think. Would add, you might have, it may be, an advisory opinion could be very useful if it were specific.
The microphone, Larry.
So if it were to a specific violation, so that if after Christian's initiative, and you discuss why the veto, they try to defend, and then the General Assembly could simply adopt a resolution and say, no, we don't agree with it, and you're casting the veto as a violation of the Charter. The GA can do that. The GA can give its opinion all the time, and as you were saying, if the Council is not fulfilling what it has been asked to do, the GA should take it back. And then maybe you could ask the ICJ, was the veto in that particular case, as the GA thought, a violation of the Charter? And then if you get an ICJ opinion that says, yes, it's a violation of the Charter, you might have more political support from Paraguay and Sweden to take action against, the General Assembly can recommend that all states stop importing German cuckoo clocks or whatever. They can recommend all kinds of things, and they just haven't done it. But if you get 150 countries that either cut up diplomatic relations or stop importing oil or stopping doing X, Y, and Z for an aggressor state, that can have an effect. I think now they're shielding themselves behind the veto and saying, well, if the Council doesn't adopt a binding decision, we can do nothing. But each of those countries can individually do it, and coalitions of the willing can be used in the GA just as it is in the Council. And that should be used, I go with, and the ICJ opinion could be used within that context, Christian's context of having the GA reassert its authority.
Yeah. I'd like to put on record that the International Peace Institute supports Larry Johnson in his opinion. I haven't taken the pulse of the organizer of the office, but how would you react to that?
Well, I think I'm going to dumb it down in a manner that you may find irresponsible. But, ultimately, look, we have a treaty that is a really, really good treaty. That treaty has a provision that says there are 5 states that can block a decision in the Security Council. You have also a treaty that says the treaty can only be changed if these 5 same members agree to change the treaty. So that power is not going anywhere. So I think the problem, you can turn the problem on its head and say the problem is actually us who don't have the veto because we accept all this and we're so complacent. So we walk out of the room and say, oh, another veto, this is so terrible. We go home, we write a political report and say, oh, the system is broken. But that's not our job. Our job is to say, well, if you don't do it, then we do it. And I think if we assert our power, and that's power that we actually have in a different way, then we will see a very different response from the Security Council, because then those on the Council will think, okay, the power that is invested in the Council is migrating elsewhere, and we don't want that. Yeah. And, there are other systems that have, a lot of national systems have de facto veto powers, that you have a head of state that has to sign legislation, that person can say, well, I can't find the pen, don't like this, not sign it. That's a veto power. Do they do it? No. Why don't they do it? Because they can't afford to do it. Because they can't afford to do it politically, because it creates a crisis in the system. And so our response to the veto is actually what matters the most. And that we're saying we are no longer accepting this because this destroys the system. This is an organization about peace and security. We have given you the job to look after peace and security. If you can't do it, then we are doing it.
Yeah. Actually, there's another problem as well that we see creeping into the system, the unanimity principle, which we tried to get out of the system after the League of Nations with Article 19, majority voting. And it's coming back in the guise of nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, the consensus rule. And that's really dangerous. It's, if we're opposing the use of the veto and the way it's being used, we can't also, as member states, then try and carve it out for ourselves in the General Assembly. You can't have it both ways. And that has to be sort of also dealt with. We go back to Article 18, everyone has a vote. No consensus rule applies except for financial matters. But I think they go together almost. Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, if I could try to respond to Larry's question, which was, why not take a particular veto to the ICJ? And in my book, I argue for taking a generic question to the ICJ, because I fear that, you know, if you are challenging a veto by Russia or a veto threat by China or a veto by the US, it will look very political. And there's just no way of avoiding that. And I would like to take it away from the politics to kind of an abstract level and talk about legal propositions and the protection against genocide occurring wherever and whenever it may occur. So I was in favor of a generic question. You're right, an advisory opinion doesn't immediately change behavior. It's non-binding. It is advisory, but I think it would be very authoritative. I would argue for that as a first step. You are right, of course, that one could take particular vetoes. A veto in the face of genocide, there has to be jurisdiction, and some have the reservation against being sued at the ICJ. Under the Torture Convention, ICJ suits are allowed, but I'm afraid that if you could do it, a particular veto, let's say it seems to further torture, bring a suit under the Torture Convention. But I think we're then getting into a very political arena. And as an international lawyer, I just think it would be better to talk about the protections of international law, the protections under the Charter, and keep it in the abstract and start in that way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the floor is open. Who else? Yes, sir, please.
So thank you, Tim, for your dedication to bringing this film to life. So Zed had opened up of like what to add to the documentary. So I'm going to give part commentary to that and then get to the question. So I think one thing that would really be helpful is,
Sorry, could you introduce yourself so we know where you're from?
My name is Jose Garcia. I'm a former board member of the United Nations Association Brooklyn chapter. So I've been on the IPI mailing list for years. That's how I came familiar. The gentleman in the 1946 said that we hope the veto will go away. That clearly didn't happen. It was the opposite, as the professor had mentioned. Where did we veer off course? Was it the Cold War? Was it the U.S. possibly like using the veto power in defense of Israel because they felt a moral obligation to protect Israel in the early years, especially with the Arab conflict? Egypt had this mandate to try to literally drive out the Jewish population, which is a whole other topic. So that would be really interesting also, because there's obviously a history to this, and why we're quagmired. You also mentioned the 9/11 shut the door, and so that was so that would be really impactful as to where did this, we had this vision and we clearly went way off base, and what led to that. The other thing I would put as food for thought is Zed had mentioned permeating the collective consciousness. Now I say this as an ignorant New Yorker. The people here really care about these issues. The typical person does not, because it has no impact on their lives, or they don't see that connection, even though the reality is this all impacts us. So what's really cool is that once in a while you see a Hollywood blockbuster movie on a topic, like, for example, Taken on human trafficking, or The Day After Tomorrow on climate change, back when it was known as global warming. You need to create a Hollywood blockbuster version of the veto. And so,
That's good.
Good. Tim?
Yes, you're right. Like, it's very interesting. When we were filming the vetoes, the text, in the library at the United Nations, it was interesting to see before that first veto was cast, there was discussion around whether, like, how does this all work? Like, that was actually the discussion. So how do we do this? And there was a discussion around whether a party should, So I think that's an interesting point, that you can actually track sort of how it went wrong and how they sort of improvised, I guess, compared with, say, the American senator who became this ambassador, like, stating very clearly that it has to abide by the law. So it seems like things were defined at the beginning, and somehow it, I mean, I think the Russian overuse was definitely, obviously, a major issue. But it's interesting when particular states sort of, dropped into use. I mean, I think in terms of the longer film too, just to get back to Zaid's point, is a part of that too will be looking at international law and respect for international law or not, because I think, as you said, that's the bigger question above all of this, I think, is the fact that there's increasingly no respect for international law and the decisions of the ICJ, then what are we all doing? So,
I mean, my understanding is that it all really started to go wrong around Suez, because you had, in the space of 3 weeks, 3 permanent members wielding vetoes. You had UK, France in the case of Suez, and the Soviet Union in the case of Hungary. And it was in that small space of time. And then you had this profusion of things happening. UNEF was created for the Sinai. You had all sorts of mechanisms come because the veto was strangling the UN, and you had a very skillful Secretary General. But you had something else, and I alluded to earlier. There's this Article 27.3 second clause, which is, there are 2 limitations, explicit limitations on the use of the veto. One is that it doesn't apply to procedural issues. And 2, if you are in the Security Council and you are a party to a dispute and the issue comes up for a vote under a resolution that's filed under Chapter 6, so it's a Pacific settlement of disputes, you then should abstain. You will actually, the language in the beginning at Yalta was should, and it became shall. And Stalin accepted it. And he said he previously would only accept the procedural exception, and he accepted it in Yalta, that it shall abstain from the vote. In 1961, that stopped happening. There were countries that were doing it up until 1961, and then it sort of slid into sort of almost disuse or misuse, no, disuse. What was so interesting about the Pact for the Future, there's this concept in international law, desuetude, which basically means that if a rule is being neglected or being violated regularly, that essentially it fades into insignificance. It sort of becomes null and void. But the Pact for the Future has asserted that this still applies. Article 27.3 still applies and must be abided by. So there's nothing to prevent member states from making declarations saying that if they were ever in such a situation in the Security Council and party to a dispute, they would abstain from the voting, just to set the rule. It would basically reestablish the rule again. Any other questions? Yes, in the back, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. I'm Shadukh Tapesh from Afghanistan, and I'm glad to be here and listening to everyone. The amazing ideas and the screening, it was great. I have 2 questions. I'm a student at the SUNY Global Engagement Program, and I have my question on my phone, sorry. The first question is, we know that some of the powerful, or the P5 countries are the most powerful. They are still, and some of them are not party to ICJ, which gives them like that leeway and not kind of accepting what's happening or vetoing against what's happening. How do you think that has given them that way to go with impunity? not being a member or accepting the ICJ's provisions on them? And the second question is how beneficial it would be to consider more members along with the P5 for the world, not only for the countries that are affected by crisis.
So this is a question directly in Christian's I think you mean compulsory jurisdiction and the ICC, right? They're not states parties to the ICC. So
ICJ.
So yeah, you mean the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ.
Okay. Well, I start with the second question. I mean, certainly the council should be larger. I mean, if you look at this really old footage, and I think it's really great to see this old footage in the movie, it's the same number of states in the council with a membership that is about, 30% of what you have now. So clearly that is wrong. What we feel very strongly about, as do others, nobody should have additional vetoes. Now we're sitting here talking about how big a problem the veto is, so I just fail to understand how you solve the problem by making it bigger first. So, I mean, that's our national position as shared by many others. I mean, on the ICJ, you can't be a member of the UN without being a member of the ICJ. So everybody is a member of the ICJ. What not everybody has accepted is compulsory jurisdiction, as Zaid has pointed out. So, many states, including us, many others, have made a declaration that says we accept the court's jurisdiction always, under all circumstances. The permanent members, or not all of them, actually none of them.
The UK.
UK maybe has done it. So they haven't done it, but they're still members of the International Court of Justice. And if we are talking about an advisory opinion, which is in a way what we have been doing here, it doesn't matter whether they accept the compulsory jurisdiction. So an advisory opinion is authoritative, but it's not. It has legal authority, but it's not legally binding. So I don't think that matters, and I think it's actually worth pointing out that the International Court of Justice is going through an amazing period of world attention and incredible relevance with all the things that they're doing on Ukraine, on the Middle East, and so on. I think I've not seen this in my career that, people follow proceedings at the International Court of Justice, which was the case, and in the South Africa, Israel case, and I think that's so encouraging and so important.
Yeah. Thank you. One more question? Yes, in the back, sir.
Thank you. Michael Cooper from the American Society of International Law. I'll be a little bit provocative if that's okay. I think that there may also be an argument that the veto has succeeded in many respects, and it depends on what you think the true purpose of the veto is. If the true purpose is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, absolute failure. But if the true purpose was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war between the great powers, it's probably done a pretty good job of separating those powers over the years. So my question is, if we were to eliminate or dilute the veto, we can imagine that there would be fewer proxy wars, fewer regional wars, fewer civil wars, a lot less suffering, but would we somehow increase the risk of confrontation between great powers?
As the layperson, I think there are different opinions. Like, for example, Andras thinks it held off World War III. Julian Borgia, when I spoke to him, said he doesn't agree. He thinks the forum of the Security Council has done that job rather than the veto itself. There
is the question of self-preservation. You're talking about 5 nuclear weapon states. I mean, if they have, if they're wedded to the idea of mutual destruction and the destruction of the planet, there's very little that we can do. And you would assume that that is enough to prevent them from going to war, and that the veto is considered something obsolete. The interesting thing about the veto, it wasn't given to the P5. It was taken away from everyone else, right? Everyone had it in the League, in the General Assembly and the Executive Council. You had 4 permanent members in the Executive Council. And I think you had another 3 that were non-permanent members who didn't have, who were there but they didn't have permanent status. But they all had the veto, and it obviously didn't work very well. It didn't work. It didn't work in committees. It sort of worked later on, but it slowed everything down. And we see this. Why is climate change? Why is the climate change agenda so weak? Right? Why is it so weak? It's being run on consensus, right? The same thing can be argued in other domains across the UN. Public health or health issues. If you go consensus and you don't go majority voting, you have a real problem. And if you have a veto, it's still part of the same gumming up of the system. Sorry.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I mean, I know Andras says that in the movie, as Tim has pointed out. I don't personally understand why he says that. But I think you can go back and if you look at the moment in history and say, had there not been a veto, there would have been World War III. I mean, that's the moment that I would like to look at, because I don't know what that moment is.
That was certainly the theory in 1956 from what I read, yeah.
Right. So that was maybe the one moment.
There was a massive hesitation from the Americans about intervening in Hungary.
Yes.
Because of World War III.
Right. I think what is pointed out also in the movie is that some permanent members would not be willing to be part of the United Nations system as it is written otherwise without the veto. Yeah. And that, I think, is clearly a very valid point. Yeah. But again, for me, it's a very academic discussion, because
we don't
you in a way you're saying you have this power and only you yourself can take the power away from yourself. So what are we talking about? I mean, the abolition of the veto is simply not going to happen. So we just have to take the veto to a very different place. It's just in a very, very wrong place right now in our system. So, the abolition is not going to happen.
So, Michael, you said, abolish or modify. We can't, because that's a charter amendment. So I'm thinking go to the ICJ, go outside the system, for a ruling on it, and to chip away at some of the more pernicious outer edges of the veto. Veto use, shielding chemical weapons inspections. Okay, let's defend that legally. How is that, in line with international law obligations? So it's really just chipping away at some of our more abusive outer edges where it's shielding atrocity crimes. So just to clarify, that's kind of the core focus that, and I know that's the focus of the Act Code of Conduct and French-Mexican Initiative. Don't veto in the face of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So all of this focus is really zeroed in on the veto aiding atrocities and really questioning. We didn't have time. We need to add Hans Corell next time.
Yes.
Because the person who said that I should work on this was first Hans Corell. So I have to say former Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs under Kofi Annan, the head of the UN Legal Council, heard me give these ideas verbally, and he said, you must do this. This is, you're absolutely right. This isn't a power in the charter. So the highest authority, we get him on the longer version of the film, because he says it so powerfully.
So with that, we have a reception. We have a reception at the back of the room, or some drinks at the back of the room, so please stay and mingle. And will you all please show your appreciation, first of all, to Tim for the documentary that he's produced, and to our very fine panelists as well. Thank you.